But here's the twist. This shift isn't just about economics anymore. It's no longer just trade routes and energy surcharges. Behind closed doors in Ottawa and Brussels, conversations are happening that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Strategic conversations, ones that go beyond aluminum and nickel. They reach into the future of security, of borders, of data, of digital sovereignty. Because when one piece of a global alliance falters, the rest begins to realign. And right now, Canada is rebalancing. Quietly, steadily, and perhaps permanently. What if Ontario's pivot isn't the exception, but the prototype? What if this is just the first visible crack in a much deeper continental divide? Now imagine a scenario, one no one in Washington wants to consider publicly. What if Canadian data infrastructure, long integrated with American systems, begins to shift to European standards? What if cybersecurity protocols, telecom regulations, and digital identification systems start syncing not with the FCC or NIST, but with the European Union's GDPR framework? What happens to cross-border data flows then? What happens to joint research or to Five Eyes intelligence coordination? These aren't just hypotheticals anymore. These are live policy debates happening behind the scenes. And still, many in the U.S. act as though it's just another trade spat. But look closer and you'll see. It's something deeper. It's something structural. If you've followed us this far, pause now and make sure you're subscribed. Because where this story goes next, it won't be on the front pages. It won't be in the headlines. But it will define the decade. And you'll want to be here when it unfolds. Take Ontario's recent educational reforms. On the surface, they seem unrelated. But they're not. New bilateral agreements with European universities now allow direct exchange and credential recognition, bypassing long-standing U.S.-centric academic pipelines. Students from Ontario will study in Amsterdam and Munich, not Boston or Chicago. Research labs in Ottawa are co-developing EV battery tech with Scandinavian institutes. The intellectual currency of the next generation is now being minted in euros, not dollars. And this matters, because power isn't just measured in dollars or warships. It's measured in knowledge, in direction, in where the next startup is founded, where the next discovery is published, and Canada is quietly repositioning itself on that global chessboard. The next major shift? Logistics. Already, shipping routes from eastern Canada are being recalibrated. Port infrastructure is expanding to handle greater volume to Rotterdam, Bremerhaven, Le Havre. Quebec's Maritime Ministry has unveiled a multi-phase plan to double transatlantic cargo capacity by 2028. New cold storage facilities are being built to handle pharmaceutical exports. Products once destined for U.S. markets, now labeled and certified for European health regulators. In short, Ontario is building not a detour, but a new highway. One that avoids Washington entirely, and that highway has investors talking. European venture capital is flowing into Canadian AI startups at record pace. A French firm just partnered with a Toronto lab on neural modeling for autonomous driving systems. And those systems, they're being trained not on American road data, but on digital twins of EU cities. The future of Canadian automation is being written in the language of European regulation. And once that shift locks in, rewinding won't be easy. Could the United States adjust and respond? Of course. But the window is narrowing. Because here's the harder truth. Some in Ottawa no longer believe Washington will change. They see the 50% tariffs of 2025 not as a temporary spike, but as a symptom of unpredictability, of reactive politics, of a system more focused on domestic chaos than long-term partnerships. And Canada has run out of patience. That's not an emotional statement. It's an economic one. Patience costs money. And the money is moving east. And yet, what if this isn't just about Canada and the United States? What if Canada's pivot is merely the first domino? In recent months, whispers have emerged from Mexico City about conversations with German automakers, about renewable hydrogen deals with Denmark, about the possibility of joining a European-led clean energy alliance. And if that happens, if Mexico follows Canada's lead, The very foundation of North American trade as we know it could erode. NAFTA, USMCA, all of it becomes a historical footnote. Already, China and India are watching. So is Brazil. They see what's unfolding not as a failure of Canada-US relations, but as a signal that even America's closest allies no longer feel bound to it. Oh, that alternatives now exist and are viable. That the gravitational pull of Washington is weakening, not from a single blow, but from 1,000 quiet shifts. So ask yourself, how does this end? Will the United States wake up and rebuild trust, or will it double down on tariffs, pushing even more partners away? Will Canada become a European satellite, or a bridge between worlds, or something entirely new? And what happens when Ontario's economic engine becomes the model for other provinces? What happens when Alberta's oil starts shipping east through Arctic ports? What happens when Vancouver's ports start speaking more Dutch than English? No one knows. Not yet. But what's clear is this: the world is watching, and the continent is shifting. Ontario's quiet revolution may have started with a battery plant and a power bill, but it's ending somewhere else entirely. In new alliances, in redefined borders, in a map where the arrows no longer point to Washington but flow around it. And now, what comes next? That's what we'll explore in our next segment. But before you go, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Is North America breaking apart? Economically, diplomatically, strategically? Or is this just a necessary correction in a volatile world? But there's something deeper happening beneath the surface. A quiet, calculated re-engineering of power. Not the loud kind with speeches and sanctions. The silent kind. The one that reshapes who gets to make decisions and who simply reacts to them. While much of the world was still treating Canada as America's polite northern neighbor, the tectonic plates beneath the continent had already started to shift. What began as economic pragmatism is now revealing itself as geopolitical transformation, and if anyone still doubts the seriousness of this pivot, they haven't been watching the financial flows. Look at the numbers, look at the direction of capital. In just the last fiscal quarter, Canadian institutional investors moved over $12 billion out of U.S. commercial real estate, redirecting those funds into Scandinavian green bonds and joint ventures in French biotech clusters. Even pension funds, once a bastion of cross-border reliability, are shifting allocations. Why? Because trust, once shaken, rarely returns intact. And while Washington debates the next tariff ceiling, Ontario is writing long-term contracts with Denmark's wind turbine manufacturers and Norway's hydrogen distributors. These aren't speculative moves. They're commitments. The private sector is reading the room too. Canada's largest infrastructure firms have begun aligning their tender specs with EU procurement guidelines. Not NAFTA, not USMCA, Brussels. Because that's where the money's flowing. That's where the regulations are predictable. That's where the innovation funds are stable. And suddenly, Ottawa's new tech districts are seeing pitches in French and German, not English alone. What does that tell us? It tells us Canada isn't hedging. It's shifting. Slowly. Deliberately. Irreversibly. And it's doing so without asking permission. But perhaps the most symbolic blow came not from any deal or trade shift, but from a speech, one barely covered in U.S. media. Prime Minister Mark Carney stood at the Berlin Climate Forum and referred to Canada as a transatlantic partner in the 21st century equilibrium. That phrase, seemingly innocuous, shook diplomatic circles, because for decades Canada has called itself a North American partner. That's not just semantics. That's a redefinition. Ask yourself, what happens when identity shifts? When a country no longer defines itself by its geography, but by its values and partnerships? What happens to continental security, to NORAD, to supply chain sovereignty? And what if Europe responds in kind, not just welcoming Canadian exports, but treating Canada as a co-architect in global strategy? We've already seen signs. NATO's Emerging Technology Group recently invited Canadian experts to join joint AI and drone defense workshops, without involving the US. Is this just cooperation, or is it quiet succession? Meanwhile, inside Canada, public sentiment is evolving. Polls now show over 60% of Ontarians favor deeper ties with the EU over closer alignment with the United States. Younger Canadians in particular, many of whom feel disenfranchised by U.S. cultural dominance, are pushing for digital independence, a movement to decouple from American social media monopolies, app stores, and cloud infrastructures. That's not just political, that's generational. And once a generation shifts its loyalties, the policies follow, always. And, in response, silence. Washington remains fixated on its domestic gridlock, on trade deficits, on culture wars, on short-term wins. But the long-term game is slipping away, and those watching closely, Berlin, Paris, Oslo, The Hague, they're stepping into the vacuum. If the U.S. won't lead with stability, someone else will, and Canada is ready to listen. But here's the wild card. This isn't just about Canada and Europe. It's about what gets built in the space between. A new trade triangle is taking shape, one that connects Ontario's lithium fields with German EV assembly lines and then loops through Nordic hydrogen corridors. A triangle where dollars are optional, where environmental compliance isn't an afterthought but the foundation, and where every container ship bypassing American ports sends a subtle message. You no longer set the terms. This isn't a Cold War replay. It's colder, quieter, less visible, but no less real. And it's not about who has the biggest navy or the most aircraft carriers. It's about who owns the standards, who writes the code, who controls the grid. And right now, Canada is positioning itself to be at that table, not as a junior partner, but as an equal, or maybe even more. Because here's the inconvenient truth for Washington. It's not just about being betrayed. It's about being outpaced. While the U.S. ties its own hands with partisan chaos, others are moving forward. While it raises tariffs, others raise alliances. And while it clings to past dominance, Canada is engineering its escape. Quietly, systematically, intelligently. And here's a question no one's really asking in public. What happens if this model spreads to defense manufacturing? If European standards and Canadian production merge to create a new class of dual, certified aerospace components? Already whispers in Ottawa suggest that a Canadian-European missile co-development project is under exploratory talks. No need to ask Washington for export waivers. No need to wait for Congress to act. Just move forward on their own terms. So, what's the endgame? Is Canada leaving the West? Hardly. But it's redefining what the West even means, and that redefinition doesn't center on Washington anymore. It centers on cooperation, climate alignment, digital transparency, and financial foresight. That's the world Ottawa is betting on, and so far, that bet is paying dividends. But the ripple effects are only beginning. Supply chain firms in South Korea are already adjusting their routing assumptions, predicting increased Canadian-European volumes. Swiss banks are building currency exchange infrastructure specifically to support Euro-Lira-CAD flows, leapfrogging the USD altogether. And in Singapore, financial analysts now openly debate whether Ontario's lithium market should be considered part of the Eurozone industrial hinterland. That phrase alone tells a story, one that's already in motion. So ask yourself again, if all of this is happening beneath the surface, what happens when it breaks through? What happens when the maps change, not on paper but in people's minds? When the roots of trust no longer pass through DC? When the deals get signed in Brussels, the funds cleared in Frankfurt, and the infrastructure built in Thunder Bay but coded in Stockholm? Who's leading then? Who's reacting? And who's been left behind? If you've made it this far, don't forget to hit subscribe and give this video a like. It helps us reach more viewers tracking this unfolding shift in silence. And, most importantly, drop a comment below. Is Canada's pivot a warning, a blueprint, or just the beginning of something no one can stop? Now here's where it all gets even more unpredictable. Because the ripple effect of Ontario's pivot is no longer just an economic curiosity. It's becoming a geopolitical challenge, one that the United States seems wholly unprepared to confront. While Washington clings to old frameworks, new networks are rising, not in secret but in plain sight. The Canada-EU alignment has moved far beyond bilateral gestures. It's expanding into something that resembles a shadow architecture of influence, a structure parallel to what Washington used to control, but without the noise. No declarations, no alliances announced with fanfare. Just one deal after another, one handshake at a time, until the pattern becomes too big to ignore. And now, others are beginning to follow the same path. In British Columbia, government officials have begun talks with Japanese and Dutch partners for a new shipping and logistics corridor, bypassing the U.S. West Coast entirely. Under this model, green hydrogen produced in coastal Canada will be liquefied and shipped directly to Yokohama and Rotterdam, with no American ports in the chain. Meanwhile, in Quebec, new legislation is being introduced to mirror key aspects of the EU's Digital Services Act, effectively cutting American tech giants out of regulatory influence. Meta, Google, Amazon, all are being forced to negotiate access on European terms. That's not just policy, that's jurisdictional defiance. The pattern is accelerating, and the consequences are widening. Canadian defense procurement agencies have quietly placed exploratory feelers to partner with Finland on submarine design. Aerospace contracts are being structured in euros. Canadian telecom firms are buying encryption licenses from Swedish security labs, all while U.S. trade envoys remain stuck in circular talks about whether the 2025 tariff spike should be temporary or permanent. The truth is, it may not matter anymore. The conversation has already moved on. And now comes the question no one dares to ask publicly. What if the U.S. is no longer viewed as the essential partner? Not because it's being rejected, but because it's being outcompeted, not in brute force, but in reliability, in clarity, in commitment. That's what European partners offer. That's what Ottawa now seeks. In this new equation, America isn't the enemy. It's simply unreliable. And reliability is the currency of the future. Look closer and you'll see something else. The financial system itself is tilting. More Canadian companies are settling transatlantic invoices in euros, bypassing dollar dependency. Banks in Toronto are opening accounts in Frankfurt to manage EU-based liquidity. Canadian exports to the U.S. still exist, but they're shrinking. And those that remain are being priced higher, insured differently, hedged more cautiously. Risk premiums are now applied to American trade like they used to be for emerging markets. That shift in perception may be subtle, but it is seismic. And while all this unfolds, the cultural ties that once glued Canada and the U.S. together are eroding too. Canadian streaming services are signing exclusive deals with French, Belgian, and Spanish production houses. The CBC's international newsroom now shares editorial content with Deutsche Welle more frequently than it does with any American outlet. School curriculums in Ontario are incorporating European history and languages at levels unseen in decades. It's not a rejection of the U.S., it's a redirection of focus away from a single pole of influence toward plurality. But if this is a pivot, what's the destination? That's still unfolding. Yet the contours are becoming clearer. Canada is designing its next chapter not around dependency, but autonomy. A place in the world where geography is no longer destiny, where economic logic is matched by strategic maturity, where loyalty is earned through policy, not proximity. And the more that vision becomes reality, the more fragile the old model appears. Now step back and look at the map. See how the routes are changing. See how the centers of gravity are shifting. The old North American triangle, Canada, US, Mexico, is being slowly replaced by a new one, Canada, Europe, and parts of Asia. This isn't conspiracy, it's construction. Slow, quiet, deliberate. But with every ship that docks in Hamburg instead of Houston, the message grows louder. Canada is not returning to the old script, and that leaves the United States with a choice. It can engage, recalibrate, and rebuild the bridge. Or it can dig in, raise more tariffs, and watch the bridge collapse entirely. Because here's the most uncomfortable possibility. What if Canada no longer needs that bridge? What if Ottawa believes it has already crossed it? And what if, when Washington finally looks up from its own internal turbulence, it finds not betrayal, but vacancy? A partner who's moved on, a handshake no longer waiting to be returned, as Ontario signs new agreements with Estonia for blockchain technology, as Alberta begins talks with Austria on clean steel certification, as Saskatchewan opens its agricultural markets to EU pricing models, as the Pacific ports of Prince Rupert and Nanaimo get upgraded to handle intermodal transatlantic cargo, as Canadian embassies around the world receive new digital infrastructure funded not by American grants, but by European tech partnerships. As all of this happens, slowly, methodically, relentlessly, the outlines of a new alignment become visible. So now the final question becomes, is this a fracture or a metamorphosis? Is Canada retreating from something or evolving into something else entirely? And if the U.S. refuses to acknowledge that shift, what happens to its leverage, its influence, its claim to leadership in the hemisphere? Because leadership isn't a title. It's not inherited. It's chosen. And right now, the choice is being made elsewhere. Quietly, systematically, permanently. While Washington waits, others act. While it argues, others align. While it hesitates, others build. The future is not waiting. So, as we bring this chapter to a close, we ask again, who controls tomorrow's alliances? Who defines tomorrow's rules? And more importantly, who is no longer in the room when those rules are written? If this story opened your eyes to something bigger than just policy shifts, if you see how deep the fracture runs, then now is the time to act. Subscribe, like, leave your thoughts. Because this is just the beginning of a conversation the world can no longer afford to ignore. The old map is fading. The new one is already being drawn. And Canada is holding the pen.